over 44 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we're again looking at the military situation. I'm Julian Rubke, and this is Build Situation Room. And Vladimir Putin has made the situation even worse for all 39 million Ukrainians with his massive attacks on the energy infrastructure over the weekend. More than 500 drones alone on November 8th were used, along with over 42 ballistic missiles and additional cruise missiles. And all of this led to the fact that we temporarily had complete power outages across large parts of Ukraine. In some areas, power has now been restored, and we'll take a look at the videos about it. We definitely have, as just mentioned, hundreds of kamikaze drones striking various infrastructure targets across Ukraine, along with ballistic missiles causing widespread damage. Here we have a gas power plant near Kharkiv that sustained massive direct hits, severely impacting its operations and overall functionality. Several rockets hit here. All in all, it's clear that the Ukrainian army's air defenses, including the Patriot and Iris-T systems, were completely overwhelmed, simply due to the sheer number. And these are the images from Saturday evening from Ukraine's capital, Kiev. We can see it's a complete power outage. Meanwhile, as we were told, there's a total of 9 hours of electricity per day in 3 separate shifts of 3 hours each. The remaining 13 hours consist of complete power outages. And here we see the moment, so to speak, when this transition happens from complete power outage to those 3 hours of electricity that are available. We can see the lights turning on in the high rises, and people briefly have the chance, each on their own, to use their elevators again. You can actually see just how tall these buildings are. Otherwise, it's really the case that in many cities there's simply no energy available, no heating, and also no water supply at all right now as well. You always have to keep in mind the natural water pressure only reaches about the 2nd or 3rd floor, meaning everything above that is without water when the power goes out. That means people, including the elderly living there, have to go to water sources, have to go to the supermarket, have to buy everything they need. And that's exactly part of the ongoing terror campaign that Russia and its leader Vladimir Putin are relentlessly inflicting on Ukraine. We want to look at this on the map, why these attacks are even more devastating this time than before, why the terrorism has become even more efficient. Unlike before, it wasn't just gas power plants that were attacked, but primarily critical transformer substations situated in close proximity to the Ukrainian nuclear power plants in Khmelnytsky, Rivne, and in the western part of the country. The substations were deliberately targeted, meaning the nuclear plants continue to generate power, but the electricity can no longer be transported to where it is needed by consumers. And nuclear plants were until now always, kind of like the backbone of Ukraine's power supply. That means even if the gas power plants have been completely taken offline, even if Putin targeted the only biogas plant, which was also destroyed this weekend in Ukraine, then there were always the nuclear power plants from which energy, at least a minimum level of energy, was sent into the country. However, those aren't operational anymore either. The nuclear power plants themselves are still running, but the electricity generated from them isn't being distributed properly. So Ukraine faces this massive problem, as noted, with up to 39 million without power. Right now, a large part of Ukraine still remains without power. However, for a few hours each day, some cities and millions of people actually get the chance to cover their most basic needs for a limited time. From the catastrophic situation for civilians, we now turn to the situation on the battlefield. It's also very tense for Ukraine. We'll first look at new footage from Pokrovsk, where Russian forces have taken control of about 80 to 90% of the city. And we'll take a closer look at one specific unit, the 425th Battalion, which is still actively carrying out smaller counterattacks in the area. But just by looking at these counterattacks, it's clear that only a very small number of soldiers are being deployed. So this is the main command center. And these are the soldiers who are being deployed. There are 2 here, 2 there, maybe even 5 in one place. But it's still simply not sufficient to drive the thousands of Russians out of Pokrovsk by now. And so the Ukrainians are focusing especially on using drones to carry out targeted attacks, striking the Russians within the city and thereby minimizing their presence effectively. However, a recapture is quite clearly no longer on the agenda here. Let's check the start recordings. They're really interesting. They show us this area here, this industrial zone, and we should briefly keep that in mind because it's actually located quite clearly northeast of the city, so no longer directly within the city limits. But already at this narrow passage where it goes between Pokrovsk, which is now largely occupied, and Mirnohrad on the other side. We'll take a closer look at the Mirnohrad footage in a moment, the very one we just saw, which clearly shows this 425th unit, named Skala, attacks the Russians originates roughly from this general vicinity. That means the outermost industrial facilities just east of Pokrovsk are being attacked here and apparently are under Russian control. And there's still this very, very narrow corridor roughly here, what is it, about 2 kilometers wide. And that's exactly the possibility to keep supplying Mirnohrad, or at least to ensure the rotation of wounded and new soldiers. Our information is that rotations are still happening, so there's still a possibility, especially at night and under cover of poor weather, literally in foggy conditions, to get individual soldiers in and out of Mirnohrad. We currently have a major supply operation running from these areas toward Mirnohrad via drones. That means most of the ammunition, even small kamikaze drones, water and so on, is now being transported into and out of Mirnohrad via Ukrainian drones. And the situation in Mirnohrad itself is also quite bad. We know that over 1,000 civilians still live there, along with more than 1,000 soldiers defending the area. Because unlike in Pokrovsk, the Russians haven't managed to break through yet due to the 38th, together with the 79th Brigade, are defending so well. Putin simply uses what he always does. He's destroying the city from a distance, and here we can see footage. In this case, I hope you can make it out, of a Russian kamikaze drone. We can see it a bit right here. Here's the RPG-7 warhead and also the fluttering tape. It's some kind of thing, yeah. Tied on, you can tell the weather's bad from that. That's actually what Ukrainians said recently, which is relatively good for them. But in the background, we mainly see this 10-story residential building here. And the Russian drone is currently capturing footage of Russian bombs striking this residential building. We'll see that right now. And there are massive explosions happening right inside the building. That means the Russians are carrying out bombardments on the city from afar, attempting to destroy life there before they can move into the city. And we have another recording again from the Russian side. I think we're seeing 3 or 4 explosions now, which shows us that it's not just the small ones, quote-unquote small bombs, but large FRB-1500s, 1.5-ton heavy aerial bombs, are now being deployed to target the last remaining residential buildings where people might still be taking shelter. As mentioned, where both civilians and soldiers live, to destroy them here. We have this Russian video here, and once again, the Russians couldn't care less. It's not awkward or embarrassing for them at all to show or to be seen using these massive bombs against residential buildings by now. There it is, looks like a small plane, several meters long and wide, extremely massive in scale. This is the FAB 1500, actually equipped with a UMPK guidance kit. That means it's first released from beneath an Su-34 Sukhoi fighter jet, then unfolds its very large wings and glides all the way steadily deep into the targeted cities. Looks almost like a kamikaze plane, but it's actually a glide bomb. And now let's just take a look at the massive impact. Clearly surviving this would still be extremely difficult. If you're directly underneath a Russian bomb like this, that's the situation in Mirnohrad. Current situation, as previously noted, according to the map, about 90% of the city is still under Ukrainian control. Nonetheless, the Russians have almost fully encircled it. And again, we see when Putin can't advance on the ground, he uses firepower to make things as hard as possible for defenders and civilians there. From the Donetsk region, we move further south into the Zaporizhzhia region. There, unfortunately, we are seeing a situation in which Russia is also advancing relatively strongly and quite rapidly at this time. We have received new footage from Uspennivka, a key location that was still being held there until quite recently. Again, we see this massive use of glide bombs here. We're seeing those huge explosions now, really massive ones, partly due to soil and buildings there. This whole thing is amplified, clearly showing the shockwave. Yet we see here too, the Russians are indeed using an unbelievable number of their glide bombs, their aerial bombs, which are unleashed well in advance, long before any drones even get close to the outskirts of the settlements, and long before the first Russian foot soldiers finally set foot in the various villages. So we first see footage from the perspective of Russian surveillance drones from a relatively long distance, see dozens of impacts from Russian FAB bombs, and then we see exactly the same right away, how then, immediately after, troops enter Uspennivka, and how they attack the individual Ukrainian units identified there after this massive bombardment. The individual houses are destroyed. And then at some point we finally reach the situation where the first Russians, after the logistics have also been destroyed, as mentioned, have moved into Uspennivka and raised their flag at several different locations throughout the area. The whole thing is a major setback for Ukraine, as Uspennivka was actually one of the last villages, larger villages that had still formed a defensive line along this small river, the Vovcha. We'll take a look at this on the map in a moment, now overrun by the Russians, who are advancing further on the other side of the river. Here we see it. Uspennivka's largest residential buildings, about 1,500 residents used to live here. The town is now under Russian control. And these are the very same images we keep seeing over and over. The Russians are celebrating right amid the ruins of the city. Of course, no one can live there anymore, but the Russians don't care at all. It's just about claiming land, like I said, no matter what's happening in the west. just to conquer, to bring utterly scorched earth under their control, and thereby once again prove to the dictator in the Kremlin that they've succeeded in seizing yet another stretch of scorched and lifeless terrain by force. These are, as mentioned, recordings from Uspennivka. The neighboring village of Ribna was also captured in recent days, and here we can again see quite clearly how not only glide bombs but also fiber optically guided drones are important for the Russians. We can see that the Ukrainians' entire logistics are being targeted here, the reinforcements. The potential supply lines, meaning there were indeed several vehicles the Ukrainians tried to bring into Rybin to defend there. But as we can see from these footage, pretty intense footage, the whole thing simply isn't working out for the Ukrainians at all. By now, it's often the case on both sides that we're seeing a loss rate of 75 to 90% for all vehicles that are being deployed. That means if the Ukrainians attempt to provide support here with 20 vehicles, roughly 15 to 18 of them end up being destroyed in the process. And well, yeah, all the equipment that's being used out here has to be completely replaced in due course, without exception. Once again, we see the Russians celebrating. Reports from Uspennivka and surrounding areas under Russian control this morning confirm that even more villages in the region have now fallen, suggesting continued Russian advances here. Let's quickly check the map. Unconfirmed information so far, yet this whole thing should soon verify or prove accurate. We'll cover that accordingly in upcoming broadcasts. We're down here in the region, as mentioned, at this triangle, Donetsk region to the right, Zaporizhia to the south, and Dnipropetrovsk to the north. And what we've just seen were the footage from Uspennivka, shown here, and from Rybin further up north. But we can already clearly see from yesterday's detailed map by Deep State Map, our trusted and reliable map provider, that the Russians have advanced up to 8 kilometers here, and also about 5 kilometers further in this area, pushing steadily westward. And this makes things increasingly difficult for the city down here, Huljapol. A former town, I think, with 15,000 to 20,000 residents, just a small town, yet a key location for Ukraine to hold this stretch of the front line. Currently, if things continue moving in this direction, it's simply down to just a few more days ahead, given the rapid speed at which the Russians advanced over the weekend, before Huljapol is completely cut off from the north as well, leaving it increasingly vulnerable and exposed to attacks from multiple directions by Russian forces. We're returning once again to Donetsk, where we'll see that the Russians aren't only targeting military vehicles, but also clearly marked civilian vehicles, aid groups and evacuation teams, deliberately targeting them with their drones. We've actually got some really unique footage from the organization Proliska, which they've posted publicly on their official Facebook page. And you can see here, first of all, the view from the inside. It's actually a small delivery van, which happens to be marked as civilian. Of course, we'll see the outside marking shortly, designated as humanitarian. And yet, the Russians are now attacking here with a fiber optic guided drone. At the very last moment, everyone here scrambles out of the vehicle, desperately trying to get away. Let it run just a little bit longer. Watch, the drone's already crashed right down here. And we see again, the Russians have once more seized this opportunity. Here we see it exactly. Here comes the Russian drone, the fiber optic guided drone flying straight toward the vehicle. Above it, unfortunately not fully in view, are erected nets. That means the Russians managed to fly right in because the Ukrainians reacted very late and were far too slow in beginning to set up these essential protective nets. At a time when the front line was already relatively close, when there wasn't much left you could build anymore. We can see it's all broken here, this network at the various locations. So the Russians managed to fly in, arrive here now with the kamikaze drone and directly attack the vehicle. And once again, it's clear as if there's one thing the Russians have absolutely no respect for, it's peace doves and similar symbols painted on it. The vehicle is clearly marked on all sides, and from the front too, as we'll see in a moment, that's where the drone hit. And yet the Russians attacked it directly. Apparently there were journalists on board as well. Here we don't actually see any soldiers, just individuals with cameras or people wearing blue uniforms. That was the operation, that was the attack. If there had been a driver inside, he would have died at that moment. The Russians, the Ukrainians, and the organization members were extremely lucky to have gotten out at the very last second. They made it out, but that's just the reality. Russia doesn't care about any civilian vehicles, not even markings, and as a result, it's extremely difficult, and that becomes clear once again, to see where the force is going. So this warhead that was attached passed straight through the entire vehicle and came out the back. That's one of the fragments that would have wounded or even killed every single person inside the vehicle without any doubt. The whole thing, as seen, is once again this dove of peace. So it's naturally cynical when people in Germany take to the streets with doves of peace and pro-Russian messages. You can clearly see it all right here. This is what's really happening while Russia is attacking Europe. The footage we just saw from Kostiantynivka, where Bakhmut is just a few kilometers away. And there, the Ukrainians are attacking with their drones, not civilian vehicles, but military ones. We have a video here that clearly shows us this seemingly ordinary structure. What exactly is this here? A garage, a bungalow, or something along those lines, inside which a BM-21 Grad rocket launcher is hidden away. belonging to the Russian army, which, as mentioned here, was stationed and attempted to be concealed near Bakhmut, but the Ukrainian drone had already identified it well in advance and is now launching a precise attack. You can see, I think for the first time here, the two tires of the vehicle, and now at the last moment, I hope you can make it out, you can also see what's actually underneath. Here we can see quite clearly, yes, that all 40 rockets are mounted on the back of this launcher, while actually the tubes where the rockets are loaded into positioned along the frame structure itself. The Ukrainians find and destroy it, clearly illustrating this contrast in a particularly evident way. Russians out on the hunt for absolutely everything that moves, every single living thing, and civilians as well. The Ukrainians, in contrast, act very selectively, only launching attacks when they're completely and entirely certain it's a legitimate military target. And all of this not just thematically close to one another, but also in very close geographic proximity. We've just seen the detailed footage showing the attack that took place on the civilian vehicle in question earlier today. These recordings come from Kostiantynivka, which is relatively close to the Russians. We can already see that it has spread into several districts of Kostiantynivka, and the other footage comes from the farthest corner of our screen, specifically from the area just east of Bakhmut city, near the outskirts. That means they've managed to reach up to 20 kilometers behind the front lines using this small drone. We just saw it. It was a radio-guided, actually a radio-controlled drone. Flew past Bakhmut and successfully managed to hit the Russian BM-21 Grad rocket launcher on the opposite side. So once again, a fairly clear picture emerges of who is consistently committing daily war crimes and who is steadfastly adhering to the long-standing principles of international humanitarian law. And before we get to Ukrainian long-range attacks on targets in Russia or Russian-occupied areas, let's first take a look at the Ukrainians' defensive capabilities, specifically against the drones we just saw. There's an extremely fascinating video, I think, that actually shows how these loitering munitions can be essentially neutralized, and there's only one way. Here we see Ukrainian soldiers approaching one of these loitering munitions from behind. It looks really strange indeed, but we can still make out quite clearly he's actually holding on to this. Places to stop along this muddy road, probably started 5 or 10 kilometers away in Russian-occupied territory, flew here and is now waiting for a vehicle. And we can see here quite clearly this is shown from behind, meaning the Ukrainians are approaching directly from the rear, so the drone's camera doesn't detect them coming, because the loitering drone naturally transmits everything happening live via its VTX throughout the entire time, so if a vehicle approaches here, it can instantly be deployed. The Ukrainians approach from the rear, and now we'll see one here soon. The only chance against these loitering munitions or fiber optic drones, if shooting them down isn't an option, is to simply cut through this thin cable. That's what he's doing now. You can see it quite clearly. Here you can see it once more. This is the small beam shears he's holding in his hand, which he used at that moment to effectively and safely disable the drone. The other soldier then asks whether there's a secondary control, meaning if there's a radio control as well, because that would be pretty bad. Then you'd always have the situation where the drone could activate and attack them. However, the soldiers quickly realize here that the drone can no longer be controlled, as the connection for control and video feed to the operator is completely gone, which means they're now able to move around relatively unharmed and without immediate threat. And now we can see once again in even greater detail exactly how the Russians construct these drones, with that 10 or 20 kilometer spool securely attached underneath, quite large in size, and mounted up top the RPG-7 warhead is firmly secured with tape. Yeah, typically put together in a very makeshift way by Russian operators, just as they're able to do it, just as they're able to build it at the moment. But fortunately, the Ukrainians managed to defuse it right away, and as a result, they were able to eliminate the danger here effectively and without delay. The only other solution, as I already mentioned, is to shoot down these drones, bringing them down with rifles or shotguns to effectively neutralize the threat. There's also a newly released video from eastern Ukraine on this very topic, and now we're going to take a closer look at it. How they first shoot at these passing drones with an AR-15 and then immediately afterwards with a shotgun. I hope you can clearly see it right away up here, the drone. That's the Russian drone slowly coming in toward the area. And the Ukrainians have become so advanced in their tactics and defensive capabilities that they're now consistently able to shoot down these drones even when using partially fragmented or less than ideal ammunition, as we've just seen moments ago. A few bullets, a few rounds, whatever it was, managed to hit it, and so it went down as a result. This is a typical shotgun here. We can also see 2 hits from the drone, which then consequently loses its flight attitude and crashes nearby. That means it's definitely possible but extremely dangerous for the Ukrainians. We can see they've been staying here undercover the whole time and apparently haven't been spotted by the drones. We see each drone flies past them, none heads straight for them. So the Ukrainians are trying again. Now they've hit once more just to spare their comrades here from harm by lying in wait for the drones at ground level, using these types of firearms, either assault rifles or shotguns, as an effective and practical means of defense. The whole thing is still extremely dangerous. We just saw it. If you don't happen to have wire cutters and the thing isn't moving, that fiber optic guided drone, or if you're not prepared and set up an ambush for the drone, it's hardly possible to defend yourself against fiber optic guided Russian drones. In closing, as announced, we now come to the topic of long-range attacks. Here too, Ukraine is actively trying every day, every night, but has significantly fewer resources available than the Russians. Namely, only a few drones, very few cruise missiles, and absolutely no ballistic missiles whatsoever. First, we'll examine the attack on an S-400 battery in Crimea, occupied and illegally annexed since 2014. And now we can see quite clearly that this S-400 launcher here, so the best one, the best system Russia has, also the most expensive one, has already been hit, and now a second drone strikes right into the launch mechanism itself, causing significant and visible damage as a direct result. We then see another perspective confirming that the whole thing is on fire, that an S-400 Triumph system has been lost for the Russians, followed by yet another attack, which shows us clearly this FP2 drone with about 200 kilometers range, and as we already mentioned yesterday, carrying a very large warhead of 105 kilos. The Ukrainians are now able to cover at least a portion of the Crimea and carry out sustained and effective active operations there, such as striking these S-400 systems or key military bases of the Russian Federation. Finally, we want to take a closer look at Ukraine's retaliatory strikes against Russian energy infrastructure. And it's always extremely important to emphasize that the Russians have been pursuing precisely this strategy since 2022. Specifically, this approach aimed at targeting civilians, while Ukraine only began adopting such measures in 2025. Began to respond in kind by deliberately targeting refineries or even critical power plants across the region. And this argument that some are currently making, that if Ukraine didn't do it, Russia wouldn't either, is utterly counterfactual, because we see that 3 years before Ukraine launched its first attack on a power plant in Russia, the Russians had already been doing it every single day. So we're now taking a closer look at the situation in Voronezh. There, one of the power plants was apparently targeted in direct response to Russia's major attacks over the weekend. However, there was not much impact there. We can also see quite clearly here that electricity is working in the homes on every floor. Here we see the lit up staircase. That means the Ukrainians simply have no chance at all of causing the damage with their small drones that they'd like to cause. Namely, destroying Russian power plants. It's more like pinpricks being inflicted there. The second incident is here in Taganrog, also in the Rostov region. Here too, a transformer substation was attacked. There were apparently, at least temporarily, power outages. So we can see Ukraine is trying to retaliate here, an eye for an eye, a tooth for what the Russians are doing. However, it's only partially succeeding, whereas, as we mentioned earlier, Russia has been extremely successful, and the strategic attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure have now led to the entire country now spending at least several hours each and every day in complete darkness.